The alarm on my wrist device screamed before my eyes even opened, and I rolled off the cot with my heart already pounding. Red light filled the small metal room. Somewhere above me, on the surface of a planet the galaxy called Worthless, something was trying to break through the outer wall of the palace. My name is Ethan Cole, and 3 months ago I was the least respected being in this entire star system. I had been given a job that every other species refused to take. I was assigned to protect a princess that everyone called broken, on a world that everyone called dead. Nobody expected me to matter. Nobody expected either of us to survive. But that morning, with the alarm screaming and dust falling from the ceiling, survival was the only thing on my mind. I grabbed my sidearm from the table and ran into the hallway. The corridor lights flickered between red and black, and I could hear voices shouting in a language I had learned just enough to understand, but not enough to be calm about. Someone was inside the palace. Someone who was not supposed to be there. I pushed open the door to the princess's chamber without knocking. She was already standing, dressed, her long silver hair pulled back, her pale violet eyes sharp and awake, as if she had never truly been asleep at all. "They found us," she said, her voice steady in a way that unsettled me more than fear would have. "Who?" I asked, even though some part of me already suspected the answer. "Does it matter?" she replied. "Get me out." I want to explain how strange this moment was, because just 3 months earlier, the idea of a human being trusted to protect a member of the Skorath royal family would have been a joke told in every court across the galaxy. And it was. I had heard that joke told to my face. When the assignment orders first arrived at the human embassy, the officer reading them out loud actually laughed before he finished the sentence. "Attaché and personal guard to Princess Vale Tarun of House Skorath, stationed on the world of Korathine Minor." He looked at me like I had been given a punishment instead of a post. "You know what that planet is, right?" he asked. "Barren. Dead soil, dead air outside the domes, nothing worth mining, nothing worth farming. The Dominion sends people there when they want them forgotten." "And the princess?" I asked. He smiled in a way that was not kind. "They call her the Barren Princess. Not because of the planet, because of her. No psionic gift, no royal bloodline power, nothing the nobles consider worth having. She embarrassed her family just by being born the way she is. Now they've sent her to a dead world to match her name, and they've sent you to babysit her, because nobody else wanted the job, and humans don't exactly get to pick their assignments yet." I did not respond to that. I had learned early in my career that responding to insults from other species rarely helped anything. Humanity was new to the wider galactic community, barely a few decades into contact, and most species still viewed us the way you might view a clever animal, useful for simple tasks, not to be trusted with anything important. I packed my gear that night without telling anyone how I felt about it. The truth was, some small, stubborn part of me was almost relieved. Nobody was watching this posting. Nobody expected anything from me. That meant nobody would notice if I built something real out of it. I did not know yet how right, and how wrong, that feeling would turn out to be. The transport ship that carried me to Korathine Minor was crewed by a mix of species, all of them polite enough, none of them particularly warm. A Velkar navigator, with gray-scaled skin, nodded at me once and never spoke again for the entire 3-week journey. A pair of Ithron engineers argued quietly about fuel ratios and ignored me completely. I spent most of the trip reading old reports about the planet I was heading toward, trying to understand what I was walking into. The reports were not encouraging. Korathine Minor had been surveyed 3 times by 3 different alien expeditions over the past 2 centuries. Each survey reached the same conclusion. The atmosphere outside the domed cities was thin and unstable. The soil held almost no nutrients. Radiation levels near the equator made long-term settlement unwise. Every species that studied the planet eventually gave up and moved on to easier worlds. It was, in every practical sense, considered a graveyard with air domes on it. And that was exactly why the Dominion had chosen it for the princess. When I finally stepped off the transport and into the receiving hall of the palace dome, the air itself felt heavy, recycled, carrying a faint metallic taste that I would later get used to. A tall attendant in deep blue robes greeted me with the kind of stiff formality that told me exactly how unwelcome I was. "You are the human," he said, not as a question. "Ethan Cole," I answered, extending a hand out of habit before remembering that handshakes were not a universal custom. He looked at my hand as if I had offered him something strange, then turned and led me deeper into the palace without another word. I met Princess Vale Tarun for the first time in a wide, cold room with tall windows that looked out over a landscape of gray dust and broken hills. She did not turn to face me right away. She stood with her back to the door, watching the barren horizon as if she were searching for something that had been lost out there. "So," she said finally, "they sent me a human." "They did," I said. "Do you know why I am here?" she asked. "I was told you were sent here as punishment," I said honestly. I had decided on the transport ship that honesty, even blunt honesty, would serve me better than flattery in a place like this. She turned then, and I saw her face fully for the first time. She was younger than I expected, her features sharp and elegant in the way of her species, her violet eyes carrying a tiredness that seemed far older than her years. "Punishment," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "That is one way to describe it." "What's another way?" I asked. She studied me for a long moment, long enough that I began to wonder if I had overstepped some boundary I did not yet understand. Then, quietly, she said, "A way to make sure I disappear, without anyone having to admit they wanted me gone." I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, and something about my silence seemed to satisfy her more than words would have. Over the following days, I learned the rhythm of the palace. It was smaller than I expected, more of a fortified estate than a true royal court, staffed by a skeleton crew of guards and attendants who treated their posting here the way soldiers treat an unwanted transfer to a forgotten outpost. Most of them avoided speaking to the princess directly unless required. Most of them avoided speaking to me entirely. I did not let that stop me from doing my job properly. I mapped every corridor, every entrance, every weak point in the dome's defenses. I studied the guard rotations and found gaps that worried me. I requested equipment upgrades that were denied without explanation. I began to understand, slowly, that this posting had been designed to fail. The princess noticed my efforts before anyone else did. I found her one evening in the palace archive, a small room filled with old data tablets and dust-covered shelves, reading through records that looked centuries old. She glanced up when I entered, but did not tell me to leave, which by then I had learned was as close to an invitation as she offered. "You have been busy," she said. "Someone should be," I answered. "The security here is a disgrace." A small, humorless smile crossed her face. "You say that as though it surprises you. This entire posting is a disgrace, by design. Do you think the guards assigned here were chosen for their skill? I'm starting to understand that, yes. Then you understand more than most of the fools who have stood where you are standing," she said. 3 attachés before you. None of them lasted more than a season. They found the work beneath them, or the isolation unbearable, or they simply stopped trying once they realized nobody was watching. "I'm not planning on being the 4th, I said. She looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her violet eyes. "We will see," she said, and returned to her reading. I did not know, in that quiet archive room, that those words would become a kind of promise between us, one that neither of us fully understood yet. Outside, beyond the dome's reinforced walls, the wind carried gray dust across empty hills, and somewhere in the depths of the Dominion's grand court, powerful people were already making plans that involved neither of us surviving this posting for very long. I did not know their names yet. I did not know their reasons. All I knew was the alarm that would wake me weeks later, the sound of something breaking through a wall that was never supposed to be breached, and the calm, unshaken voice of a princess who had already decided, long before I arrived, that she was done being called Barren by a galaxy that had never bothered to understand her at all. That morning, as I pulled her through the smoke-filled corridor toward the escape route I had mapped weeks before, without telling anyone why, I finally understood that this posting was never going to be the quiet, forgotten assignment everyone expected it to be. It was only the beginning. The corridor ahead of us was filled with smoke, and somewhere behind that smoke I could hear metal grinding against metal, the sound of something forcing its way through a wall that had stood untouched for decades. I kept one hand on Leora's arm and the other on my sidearm, guiding her toward a service passage that most of the palace staff did not even know existed. I had found that passage during my first week on Corathene Minor, back when the biggest danger I imagined facing was boredom. I had spent hours walking every hallway, checking every door, memorizing every possible route in and out of the dome. At the time, I told myself I was simply being thorough. Looking back, some quiet instinct in me had already known that thoroughness would one day save both our lives. "This way," I said, pulling open a narrow hatch hidden behind a wall panel. Leora did not hesitate, did not ask questions, simply followed me into the darkness beyond. That alone told me how much had changed between us since that first cold meeting in the observation room. 3 months earlier, she would have demanded an explanation before taking a single step. Now she trusted my judgment enough to walk blind into a passage she had never seen before. We moved quickly through the narrow service tunnel, the sound of the attack growing fainter behind us with every step. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and controlled, the way I had been trained to keep it during moments like this. Beside me, Leora's breathing was steady too, though I could feel the tension radiating from her. "You knew this was coming," I said quietly, more statement than question. "I suspected," she answered. "I did not know when." "You could have told me. Would it have changed anything?" she asked. "You already prepared for exactly this. You built an escape route before anyone gave you a reason to need one." She was right, and there was no point arguing about it while alarms still echoed somewhere above us. I focused instead on getting us both to the small transport bay hidden beneath the palace, a bay that officially did not exist on any Dominion record, because I had spent weeks quietly building it myself, piece by piece, from salvaged parts nobody thought to track. That decision, more than anything else, was the reason we were still alive. To understand how we reached this moment, I have to go back to the early days after that first meeting in the archive room, when Corathene Minor still felt like nothing more than a forgotten dumping ground for people the Dominion wanted to ignore. The planet itself fascinated me in ways I had not expected. Every alien survey team that studied it before me had reached the same conclusion, that the world was dead, useless, unworthy of real investment. But the more time I spent there, the more I began to notice details those surveys had missed. The domes themselves, though old and poorly maintained, were built on a foundation of unusually stable rock, far more resistant to the planet's frequent tremors than any of the survey reports suggested. The soil outside the domes, while thin and difficult, was not entirely without nutrients, just difficult in ways that required patience rather than advanced technology to work around. I began spending my off hours with the small human support team that had been sent along with me, a group of engineers and technicians who, like me, had been given this posting because nobody expected much from us. Among them was a quiet, sharp-minded engineer named Callum Bright, who had spent years working reclamation projects on damaged worlds back in human territory before joining the Dominion Liaison Program. "They call this place Barren," Callum said to me one afternoon, kneeling beside a patch of gray soil outside the dome's outer wall, running a handful of it through his fingers. "But barren isn't the same as dead. Barren just means nobody's tried the right thing yet." He showed me small experiments he had been running in his spare time, modest attempts to coax life from the thin soil, using techniques adapted from old human reclamation projects. Methods most alien engineers considered too slow, too unglamorous, too beneath their attention. Within weeks, small patches of hardy green growth had begun appearing in places the Dominion survey teams had declared permanently lifeless. I brought Leora to see it one evening, more out of curiosity than any real plan. I remember the way she knelt beside the small patch of green, her fingers hovering just above it, as if afraid that touching it might make it disappear. "This should not be possible," she said quietly. "According to the surveys, no," I agreed. But the surveys were done by people looking for reasons to give up on this planet. Callum wasn't looking for reasons to give up. She looked up at me then, and something in her expression had shifted, a kind of curiosity replacing the guarded coldness I had grown used to. "Your people do this often? Find value where others see none?" "More often than we get credit for," I said. From that point forward, something between us began to change, slowly, carefully, the way trust often builds when neither person is in a hurry to name it. She began joining me and the small human team during our evening walks along the dome's outer perimeter, asking questions about our reclamation methods, about human history, about the strange, stubborn optimism that seemed to drive people like Callum to keep trying long after logic suggested they should stop. I learned more about her too, during those walks. I learned that the title Barren Princess had followed her since childhood, long before she was ever sent to this planet, a cruel nickname given to her by rival nobles because she had been born without the psionic gifts that ran through most of House Skorath's bloodline. Among her people, psionic ability was considered a mark of true royal worth. Without it, she had spent her entire life treated as an embarrassment, a flaw in an otherwise powerful family line. "They did not send me here because of politics alone," she admitted one evening, as we stood watching the sun set over the gray hills, painting them in unexpected shades of orange and violet. "They sent me here because it was easier than admitting they never wanted me in the succession line at all. A barren world for a barren princess. A tidy little joke for the entire court to enjoy." "It's not much of a joke from where I'm standing," I said. She glanced at me, something almost like a genuine smile touching the corner of her mouth. "No," she agreed, "it is not." It was during this period, when trust between us was still new and fragile, that the first real threat to our safety appeared, though at the time neither of us recognized it for what it truly was. A trade envoy arrived at the dome one morning, requesting an audience with the princess regarding mineral rights to a small mining operation on the far side of the planet. The envoy, a smooth-spoken Velkar named Desserin, carried himself with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted through conversation alone. I did not trust him from the moment he stepped off his transport. There was nothing overtly threatening about him. His questions about the mining rights were reasonable, his manner polite, his offers generous, by any normal standard. But I had spent enough time reading people during my years of training to notice the small details that did not fit. The way his eyes lingered too long on the palace's security arrangements. The way his questions, though framed as business, always seemed to circle back toward information about the princess's daily movements, her guard rotations, the layout of the palace itself. I raised my concerns with Leora after the envoy departed. "You believe he was gathering information," she said, more statement than question. "I believe he was gathering exactly the kind of information someone would need if they were planning something other than a mining deal," I said. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out toward the horizon where the envoy's transport had already disappeared into the gray haze. "Desserin serves House Calthorn," she said finally. "They have opposed my family's position in the succession council for generations. If they are showing interest in this posting, it is not because of mineral rights." That was the first time I heard the name Calthorn, though it would not be the last. Over the following weeks, I began quietly expanding my security preparations, using resources that officially did not exist, building contingencies that nobody outside our small circle knew about. I trained the human support staff in basic defensive protocols, disguised as routine safety drills. I built the hidden transport bay beneath the palace, piece by piece, using salvaged parts that Callum sourced through channels I chose not to ask too many questions about. Leora never asked me to stop these preparations, even when the official Dominion oversight officer questioned why our supply requisitions kept growing. She simply signed off on whatever explanations I provided and let me continue working. "You believe something is coming," she said to me one night, as I finished installing a reinforced lock on the archive room door. "I believe it's better to be ready for something that never happens than to be caught unprepared for something that does," I said. She considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly. "My family has spent my entire life underestimating me because I was born without the gifts they valued," she said. "I have learned, painfully, that being underestimated is not always a weakness. Sometimes it simply means fewer people are watching what you choose to build in the quiet spaces they never bother to look at." I did not fully understand the weight of those words until much later, when I realized just how much of her own quiet preparation had been happening alongside mine, hidden in places even I had not thought to look. The weeks that followed were, on the surface, calm. The trade envoy did not return. The Dominion Oversight Officer eventually stopped questioning our supply requisitions, distracted by more pressing matters elsewhere in the sector. Callum's reclamation experiments continued to show promising results. Small patches of green slowly spreading across the gray hills outside the dome, drawing quiet interest from a handful of scientists who had not yet written off the planet entirely. But beneath that calm surface, I could feel something building, a tension that reminded me of the stillness before a storm, the kind of quiet that experienced soldiers learn never to fully trust. I spent my evenings continuing to strengthen our defenses, and my days growing more familiar with a princess the galaxy had dismissed as barren and broken, a woman I was slowly beginning to realize was neither of those things. She was sharp, thoughtful, carrying a quiet strength that had simply never been given room to show itself under the weight of her family's constant judgment. The night the alarm finally sounded, 3 months after I first arrived on Corathene Minor, I was not surprised. Some part of me had been waiting for it since the moment Desseran's transport first appeared on the horizon. What did surprise me was how calm Leora remained as I pulled her through that hidden service tunnel toward the transport bay, smoke and alarms fading behind us, the weight of everything we had quietly built together now the only thing standing between us and whatever House Calthorn had sent to erase her from the succession line for good. "Whatever happens next," she said quietly, as we reached the hidden bay and the small transport ship I had spent months preparing in secret, "I want you to know that you were the first person in a very long time who did not treat my posting here as a punishment to be endured." "It was never a punishment," I said, powering up the transport's engines. "Not from where I was standing. Outside, the sound of the attack grew louder, closer, and somewhere above us, the palace that had been our quiet, forgotten home for 3 months was about to fall into hands that meant us nothing but harm." I sealed the bay doors, set our course away from the dome, and prepared myself for whatever came next, knowing that whatever this planet's barren surface had hidden beneath it, we were about to find out together. The transport shook as we cleared the dome's outer shell, and through the small viewport I caught one last glimpse of the palace behind us, smoke rising from a breach in the northern wall, small figures moving across the courtyard in formations that told me exactly what kind of force had been sent to end this quietly. Not a raiding party looking for valuables, an extraction team, sent to remove a problem the Calthorn family had decided could no longer be tolerated. "They will track this transport," Leora said, watching the same scene fade behind us. "It is registered to the palace systems." "It's not," I said. "I built it off the books, remember? No registration, no tracking beacon, nothing tied back to any official record." She turned to look at me then, something between disbelief and admiration crossing her face. "You built an entire untraceable transport ship in secret, beneath a palace full of Dominion oversight officers, and none of them noticed." "They weren't looking," I said. "Nobody expected the human attaché to be capable of something like that. Being underestimated has its advantages, remember." A small, tired laugh escaped her, the first genuine sound of relief I had heard from her since the alarms first sounded. "You learn quickly," she said. I guided the transport low across the gray hills, staying beneath the range of most standard detection arrays, heading toward a location I had chosen months earlier during my initial survey of the planet. A location I had never mentioned to anyone, not even Callum. An old, abandoned research outpost roughly 200 kilometers from the Palace Dome, built decades earlier by one of the previous survey teams before they gave up on the planet entirely. According to the old records I had found buried in the Palace archive, the outpost had been sealed and forgotten, its location scrubbed from most current maps during a data migration decades ago. It was, as far as I could tell, the one place on this entire planet that House Calthorn would have no reason to search first. We reached it just as the first hints of dawn began to color the horizon, a low, half-buried structure built into the side of a rocky hill, its outer shell weathered, but still intact. I landed the transport in a narrow ravine nearby, camouflaged from most standard aerial scans by the natural terrain, and we made our way to the outpost's sealed entrance on foot. It took nearly an hour to override the old security lock, using a combination of tools I had brought along and a fair amount of patient trial and error. When the door finally hissed open, releasing decades of stale, trapped air, we stepped into a facility that looked frozen in time, equipment covered in dust, screens dark and lifeless, the quiet stillness of a place nobody had entered in a very long time. "What is this place?" Leora asked, running her fingers along an old data terminal covered in a thick layer of gray dust. "An old survey outpost," I said, "abandoned decades ago when the last team gave up on this planet. I found it in the archive records during my first week here. Figured it might be useful someday." "You have been planning for this moment since your very first week," she said, not quite a question. "I've been planning for something," I admitted. "I didn't know exactly what. I just knew this posting was more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit, and I'd rather be prepared for the wrong thing than caught unprepared for the right one." We spent the following hours restoring power to a small section of the outpost, enough to bring a few systems back online, enough to give us light, basic communication shielding, and access to whatever old records remained stored in the facility's local systems. It was while searching through those records that we found something neither of us expected. Buried deep in the outpost's old survey logs, beneath layers of routine geological data, was a set of encrypted files that the original survey team had apparently never finished analyzing before their mission was cut short. Leora, drawing on knowledge of old Dominion encryption standards that predated most modern systems, managed to unlock a portion of the files after several hours of careful work. What we found inside changed everything. The files contained detailed scans of a mineral deposit deep beneath the planet's surface, a rare compound the old survey team had labeled with a designation neither of us recognized. According to their notes, the compound possessed unusual energy properties, capable of significantly enhancing the efficiency of certain types of shielding and power systems, properties that, based on the scattered notes left behind, the original researchers considered potentially revolutionary before their funding was abruptly cut and the outpost sealed. "This is why they called the planet worthless," Leora said slowly, reading through the fragmented notes. "Not because there was nothing here, because whoever controlled access to this data made certain nobody else would ever find it." "You think someone buried this on purpose?" I said. "I think," she said carefully, "that a compound this valuable, discovered on a world with no strong political interests to protect it, would have made an extremely convenient prize for whichever house managed to quietly secure exclusive access to it, long after everyone else had been convinced the planet held nothing worth investing in." The pieces began falling into place slowly as we worked through the remaining files. The original survey team's mission had been abruptly canceled decades ago, their findings sealed, their outpost abandoned under circumstances that, according to a handful of surviving personal logs left behind by the lead researcher, had never been fully explained to the team itself. Shortly after the mission was canceled, the planet's official designation shifted from unexplored to barren and unworthy of further investment, a designation that had stood unchallenged ever since. "House Calthorn," Leora said quietly, connecting the pieces with a certainty that chilled me. They have held quiet influence over mineral survey policy in this sector for generations. If they discovered this compound decades ago and buried the evidence, keeping the planet officially worthless would ensure nobody else ever came looking. And then they arranged to have you exiled here, I said, the full shape of it finally becoming clear. Not just to remove you from the succession line, to keep an unwanted royal quietly contained on a world they already controlled behind the scenes, far from anyone who might ask the wrong questions. And when I began building genuine value here, she continued, her voice growing sharper with each word, when your people's reclamation work began drawing outside attention, when the planet started looking less barren and more promising, I became a liability instead of simply an inconvenience. It was a lot to process, sitting in that dusty, half-powered outpost, but the pattern held together too well to dismiss as coincidence. The attack on the palace had not been a simple act of political cruelty. It had been a calculated move to eliminate a threat before that threat could expose decades of carefully hidden theft. We spent the rest of that day and much of the following night working through the remaining files, gathering every piece of evidence we could find, careful to make backup copies stored across multiple isolated data drives in case any single copy was lost or destroyed. Leora worked with a focused intensity I had not seen from her before, driven by something that went beyond simple survival now, something closer to a long overdue reckoning. They called me Barren, she said at one point, not looking up from the terminal in front of her. For my entire life. A joke told behind closed doors. And sometimes not even behind closed doors. And this entire time, they were sitting on proof that the very planet they used to complete that joke was never barren at all. It was simply hiding something they did not want anyone else to find. That's going to be a hard thing for them to explain away, I said. It is going to be impossible for them to explain away, she said, finally looking up, her violet eyes carrying a fire I had not seen in them before. Assuming we survive long enough to make certain the right people see it. That assumption, unfortunately, was about to be tested far sooner than either of us hoped. On the second night at the outpost, our short-range communications array picked up a faint signal, a search pattern sweeping the surrounding terrain in slow, methodical passes. I recognized the pattern immediately from my training. It was not a random patrol. It was a coordinated search, moving in a widening spiral from the palace dome outward, exactly the kind of pattern a well-organized extraction team would use when searching for a target who had fled on foot or by small unregistered transport. They're expanding the search radius, I said, watching the signal pattern on the outpost's old display. At this rate, they'll reach this ravine within 2 days. Then we need to move, Leora said. Move where? I asked. Every settlement on this planet answers to Dominion oversight in some form. If Calthorn has enough reach to organize an attack on the palace itself, they likely have enough reach to flag our arrival anywhere official. We sat with that problem for a long while, the quiet hum of the outpost's partially restored systems the only sound between us. It was Leora who finally broke the silence, her voice quieter than I had heard it since we arrived. There is one place, she said slowly, that Calthorn's reach does not extend. A place my family has avoided discussing for generations, out of shame rather than strategy, which may be exactly why it remains safe. What place? I asked. An old colony site, she said, established decades before the Dominion formally claimed this planet. Human colonists, if the records are accurate, abandoned when the Dominion took control and declared the planet unfit for continued settlement. My family has always dismissed the stories as exaggeration, evidence that this world was never worth serious investment in the first place. But if the survey team buried evidence of a valuable mineral deposit here, perhaps they buried evidence of other things as well. I felt something shift in my chest at those words, a strange mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. Human colonists, I repeated, here, before the Dominion ever arrived. I do not know if it is true, she admitted. I know only that the stories exist, buried in old family records nobody bothered to investigate seriously. If there is any chance it offers us shelter that Calthorn does not know to search, I believe it is worth the risk of finding out." We left the outpost before dawn, taking only what we could carry, leaving the transport hidden in the ravine as a decoy while we continued on foot toward coordinates Leora had pulled from an old, half-forgotten family record, coordinates that led us deeper into terrain even the original survey teams had marked as unstable and dangerous. The journey took the better part of 2 days, moving carefully across broken, radiation-scarred hills, avoiding the widening search pattern that continued sweeping the region behind us. We spoke little during those 2 days, conserving energy and staying alert, though I found myself watching Leora more closely than I had before, noticing the quiet, steady determination that carried her forward despite exhaustion, despite the growing danger, despite decades of being told by everyone around her that she was not capable of surviving something like this on her own. She was proving every single one of them wrong, one careful step at a time. We found the colony site on the evening of the 2nd day, hidden in a wide, sheltered valley that the planet's harsh surface winds seemed to avoid entirely, protected by a natural rock formation that created something close to a stable microclimate within its boundaries. What we found there stopped us both in our tracks. The remains of an old settlement stretched across the valley floor, weathered structures built in unmistakably human architectural style, faded but still standing after what must have been well over a century of abandonment. Solar collection arrays, long since inactive, lined the surrounding hillsides. A central structure, larger than the rest, stood at the heart of the settlement, its outer walls marked with faded symbols that, despite the decay, I recognized immediately as an old style of human lettering. "They were here," I said quietly, almost unable to believe what I was seeing, long before the Dominion ever claimed this planet. "It seems your people have a habit of finding value in places others dismiss," Leora said, her voice carrying something close to wonder. "Even a century ago, apparently." We entered the central structure carefully, uncertain what we might find inside after so many decades of abandonment. What we found instead of danger was something closer to a gift. The building had been sealed tightly enough, and the valley's unusual microclimate stable enough, that a significant portion of the old colony's equipment and records remained intact, protected from the worst of the planet's harsh surface conditions. Among those records, we found detailed accounts of the original colony's efforts to adapt to Corathene miners' difficult environment, decades before Callum's small reclamation experiments outside the palace dome. The old colonists had developed techniques for stabilizing the thin soil, for filtering the planet's unstable atmosphere into breathable air within sealed structures, for drawing sustainable power from the planet's unusual geological activity. Techniques that, judging by the notes left behind, had been working, slowly but steadily, right up until the colony's sudden and unexplained abandonment. Why would they leave? I wondered aloud, reading through log after log describing steady, careful progress, if things were actually working. Leora, reading a separate set of records nearby, went very quiet. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her before. "They did not leave," she said. "According to this record, an early Dominion survey team arrived, found the colony thriving against expectations, and decided the presence of an independent human settlement on a planet the Dominion wished to quietly control was, in their words, an unacceptable complication. The colonists were forcibly relocated. The settlement was marked as abandoned, and the planet's designation was quietly changed to Barren shortly afterward, to discourage anyone from asking further questions about why a functioning colony had suddenly disappeared from the official record. I stood there in the fading evening light filtering through the old structure's cracked windows, processing what she had just told me. An entire human colony, thriving on a planet the galaxy had spent decades calling worthless, quietly erased not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded in a way that threatened someone's plans. "This changes everything," I said slowly. "It does," Leora agreed. "This is no longer simply about proving House Calthorn attempted to silence a princess they considered an embarrassment. This is proof of a pattern, a planet's value deliberately hidden, not once, but at least twice, by people willing to erase entire communities to protect their own quiet control over what this world truly holds. We spent that night going through as many records as we could manage, gathering evidence, building a case far larger than either of us had expected when we first fled the palace under cover of smoke and alarms. Somewhere beyond the sheltered valley, House Calthorne's search teams continued their slow, methodical sweep across the planet's surface, drawing closer with each passing hour. But for the first time since the attack began, I felt something other than simple survival driving us forward. We were no longer just running. We were building the proof that would, one day soon, force the entire Dominion court to reckon with everything they had spent decades refusing to see, about this planet, about the people who had once thrived here in secret, and about the princess they had mocked and dismissed for her entire life without ever bothering to understand what she was truly capable of. Leora looked up from the old colony records late that night, her violet eyes reflecting the soft glow of the outpost's restored emergency lighting, and said something that stayed with me long after that night ended. "They called me Barren because I lacked the gifts they valued," she said quietly. "They called this planet barren because it did not offer them what they expected to find. Perhaps the word barren says far more about the limits of their understanding than it ever said about either of us." I did not have a response worthy of that moment, so I simply nodded, and together we continued working late into the night, preparing for whatever came next, knowing that House Calthorne's search teams were closing in, and that the fight ahead of us was no longer one we could afford to lose. The search teams reached the outer edge of the sheltered valley on the third morning, and I knew we had run out of time to simply hide and gather evidence. I watched their scout craft circle the distant ridgeline through a cracked window of the old colony structure, and I understood, with the cold clarity that only real danger brings, that staying hidden was no longer an option that would keep us alive much longer. "They will find this valley within hours," I said, watching the scout craft bank slowly along the ridge, clearly following some kind of updated search pattern that had narrowed considerably since we first arrived. "Then we do not wait for them to find us," Leora said, and something in her voice had changed since the night before, a new steadiness that had not been there when we first fled the palace. She had spent the previous night reading deeper into the old colony's technical records, records describing not just the settlement's survival techniques, but experimental work the original colonists had been conducting on personal shielding systems, adapted from the same unusual mineral compound the earlier survey team had documented deep beneath the planet's surface. The colonists, it seemed, had been developing early prototypes of a lightweight defensive technology, designed to help settlers survive the planet's unstable atmosphere and occasional radiation surges without the bulk of standard Dominion protective gear. The prototypes had never been finished. The colony's forced relocation had cut the work short, decades before it reached a usable stage, but the research notes were detailed, careful, and, according to Leora's growing excitement as she worked through the calculations, close enough to completion that finishing them might actually be possible with the tools available in the old outpost. "You want to build this now," I said, watching her work through the schematics with an intensity that reminded me of the sharp, guarded woman I had first met in that cold observation room, except now that sharpness was pointed entirely outward, toward a problem she intended to solve, rather than a threat she intended to simply endure. "I want to survive what is coming," she said, "and I believe this may be how we do it." We worked through the remaining hours of that morning with a focus I still find difficult to fully describe, gathering components from the old outpost's remaining equipment, salvaging what we could from the sealed structures around the valley, following calculations that had been left unfinished for over a century by people who never got the chance to see their own work completed. It was not easy. Several early attempts failed outright, small test components overheating or simply refusing to hold a stable charge. But Leora's mind, freed from the constant judgment of a royal court that had spent her entire life dismissing her intelligence alongside her lack of psionic ability, proved remarkably sharp when finally given a real problem worth solving. She adapted the old colonists' incomplete designs with small, careful adjustments, drawing on modern Dominion engineering principles the original colonists never had access to, combining old human ingenuity with newer knowledge in ways that gradually, painstakingly, began to work. By early afternoon, we had 2 functional prototypes, crude but stable, capable of generating a personal energy shield strong enough to deflect standard small arms fire and provide meaningful protection against the planet's radiation surges. It was not a perfect solution. It was, however, considerably more than either of us had when the search teams first appeared on the ridgeline that morning. This should not have been possible in a single day, I said, watching the small device hum quietly on my wrist, a faint shimmer of protective energy visible when I passed my hand near its field. It should not have been possible at all, according to every official survey this planet has ever received, Leora said, fitting her own prototype carefully onto her arm. Perhaps it is time the Dominion learned how much they have been wrong about, regarding this world and the people connected to it. We left the old colony structure as the search team's scout craft finally began descending into the valley, moving quickly toward a defensible position among the settlement's outer ruins that I had scouted earlier that morning, a narrow passage between 2 collapsed structures that would force any approaching force to funnel through a tight, exposed corridor before reaching us. What followed was the most difficult hour of my life up to that point, though I want to be careful in how I describe it, because I have no interest in dwelling on violence for its own sake. What matters is not the details of that confrontation, but what it proved. The search team, roughly a dozen well-equipped soldiers under House Calthorne's command, entered the valley expecting to find a stranded princess and an outmatched human attaché, easy targets for a quiet, deniable elimination far from any official record. What they found instead was a defensible position, careful preparation, and 2 people who refused to simply stand still and be erased the way earlier generations of this planet's inhabitants had been. I will not claim the confrontation was easy, or that I felt no fear during it. I felt plenty, but between the prototype shields, the defensible terrain I had chosen carefully in advance, and a princess who moved through that confrontation with a calm, calculated resolve that surprised even me, we held our ground long enough for something neither Leora nor I had planned for. The old colony's original distress beacon, a piece of equipment we had reactivated the night before simply as a precaution, had been broadcasting a low-power signal across an old, mostly forgotten frequency band since sometime after midnight. That signal, as it turned out, had been picked up by a passing survey vessel from outside Dominion space entirely, a small independent research ship that happened to be studying unusual mineral readings in the outer edge of the system, readings that, we would later learn, matched almost exactly the compound described in the old survey team's buried files. The timing was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily fortunate. The independent research vessel, curious about the distress signal and the matching mineral readings, altered course to investigate, arriving in the system's outer orbit just as the confrontation in the valley reached its most dangerous point. Their arrival, broadcast openly across standard emergency channels, was more than enough to force House Calthorne's search team into a hurried, disorganized retreat, unwilling to risk being witnessed by outside observers in the middle of an unauthorized operation on Dominion territory. By the time the immediate danger passed, Leora and I stood alone amid the old colony's ruins, breathing hard, exhausted, but alive, watching the last of the search team's transports disappear over the ridgeline. That was close, I said, allowing myself, finally, a moment to feel the full weight of how close it truly had been. Closer than I would like to experience again, Leora agreed, lowering herself carefully onto a low stone wall, the adrenaline of the past hour visibly draining from her all at once. We did not have long to recover. Within hours, a small shuttle from the independent research vessel arrived in the valley, its crew, a mix of species I did not recognize, cautious, but clearly curious about the distress signal and the unusual readings that had drawn them here. It was during that meeting, explaining as much of our situation as we felt safe sharing with strangers, that I began to understand just how significant our discovery truly was. The research vessel's lead scientist, a sharp-eyed Ithran woman named Sorrel Vane, listened carefully as Leora explained a carefully chosen portion of what we had found: the mineral deposit, the old colony, the deliberate decades-long effort to keep this planet's true value hidden from the wider galaxy. Sorrel's reaction told me everything I needed to know about how serious this discovery truly was. "Do you understand what you are describing?" she asked, her voice carrying a quiet intensity. "This compound, if it matches our readings, is not simply valuable. It could reshape shielding and power efficiency standards across half the sector, and you are telling me someone has known about this for decades and buried it, along with an entire colony's history, simply to protect their own quiet control over a planet everyone else assumed was worthless." "That is exactly what we are telling you," Leora said. Sorrel looked between the two of us for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then I believe your evidence needs to reach people who cannot be quietly pressured into ignoring it," she said. "My vessel has contacts within the Dominion's Independent Oversight Council, officials who exist specifically to investigate exactly this kind of quiet corruption within noble houses. If your evidence is as strong as you describe, they will not be able to dismiss it easily, regardless of how much influence House Calthorn holds elsewhere." It took nearly 2 more weeks to properly organize everything that followed, gathering additional evidence, verifying the mineral compound's readings through independent testing, and carefully coordinating with the Oversight Council contacts Sorrel had connected us with, all while remaining cautious about how much information we shared, and with whom, aware that House Calthorn's influence likely extended further than we could easily map. During those 2 weeks, something else happened as well, something I had not expected when this entire ordeal began. Word of an unusual distress signal, an independent research vessel, and rumors of a significant mineral discovery on a planet long dismissed as worthless began, slowly but steadily, spreading through certain circles across the sector. It was not a dramatic, sudden announcement. It was quieter than that, the kind of story that moves through scientific and trade networks first, long before it reaches any official record. But it moved nonetheless, and as it moved, the story attached to it shifted along with it. The story of a barren princess, exiled to a dead world and expected to quietly disappear, who had instead uncovered a discovery significant enough to draw outside interest from beyond Dominion space. The story of a human attaché, dismissed as an unwanted formality attached to an unwanted posting, who had spent months quietly preparing for exactly the kind of danger everyone else assumed would never come, and who had built, alongside that same princess, working technology from over a century-old incomplete research within the space of a single desperate day. I do not think either of us fully understood, during those 2 weeks of careful, exhausting preparation, just how much that story was already beginning to change the way certain corners of the galaxy viewed us both. We were too focused on staying alive, on gathering evidence, on making certain that whatever came next could not simply be buried the way this planet's true value had been buried, twice before, by people who valued their own quiet control more than the truth. But change it did, quietly and steadily, in ways that would become impossible to ignore by the time we were finally ready to return to the Dominion Court and present what we had found. I remember the night before that return clearly, sitting with Leora in the old colony structure that had, over those 2 difficult weeks, become something closer to a temporary home than either of us expected. She sat quietly, studying the schematics for an improved version of the prototype shield we had built together, her expression calm in a way that reminded me very little of the guarded, tired woman I had first met months earlier. "You have changed," I said, watching her work. She glanced up, a small, thoughtful smile touching her face. "So have you," she said, "though I suspect neither of us fully realizes how much, until we stand in front of the people who spent so long believing they already knew exactly who we were. Are you ready for that?" I asked. She considered the question carefully before answering, setting the schematics aside and looking out toward the darkened valley beyond the old structure's cracked window, the same barren, gray landscape that had once been dismissed by every survey team who ever studied it, now holding secrets significant enough to challenge one of the most powerful noble houses in the entire Dominion. For most of my life, she said quietly, I believed the things they called me: barren, broken, unworthy of the family name I was born into. I believed it because I had no proof otherwise, and because believing it was, in some strange way, easier than fighting a title everyone around me seemed so certain was true. She turned back to look at me then, her violet eyes steady, carrying none of the tired resignation I remembered from our very first meeting. I do not believe it any longer, she said, and I intend to make certain that when we return, the entire court understands exactly why. I did not doubt her, not even for a moment. Whatever calm, uncertain young woman had first stood before me in that cold observation room 3 months earlier had been forged, through danger and discovery and quiet determination, into something the Dominion Court had never expected to walk back through their doors. The galaxy had mocked her for being barren. It had mocked me for being an unworthy afterthought, assigned to a worthless posting. Neither of us intended to let that mockery stand unanswered for very much longer. The Dominion Court sat within a vast structure of pale stone and towering columns, built centuries earlier on the Skorath homeworld, a place I had never expected to see with my own eyes when I first accepted a posting everyone considered a quiet dead end. Walking through its tall entrance doors alongside Leora, escorted by 2 representatives from the Independent Oversight Council Sorel had connected us with, I felt none of the nervousness I might have expected. Only a steady, focused readiness that had been building in me since the moment the alarms first sounded back on Corathene Minor. Word had already reached the court ahead of us. I could see it in the way heads turned as we walked the long central corridor toward the main council chamber, in the murmurs that followed our passage, in the careful, uncertain glances exchanged between nobles who clearly did not yet know how to react to the sight of a princess they had long dismissed as broken, walking through their halls with the calm, unshaken confidence of someone who had survived far worse than their judgment. Governor Aldrich Munn, the senior official overseeing this session of the Oversight Council, greeted us at the chamber entrance with a formal nod that carried more respect than I expected from a Dominion official meeting a human directly for the first time. Princess Valtaroon, Attaché Cole, he said, the Council has reviewed the preliminary evidence submitted through the independent research vessel. I will not pretend the claims within it are anything less than serious. House Calthorn has already been informed of this session and will be present to respond. Good, Leora said simply. I would prefer they hear this directly, rather than through rumor and second-hand reports. The council chamber itself was larger than I expected, tiered seating rising in a wide circle around a central floor, filled with representatives from noble houses across the Dominion, along with a smaller section reserved for independent oversight officials whose entire purpose, as Sorel had explained during our journey here, was to investigate exactly the kind of quiet corruption we were about to expose. I spotted Desseran almost immediately, seated within House Calthorn's designated section, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told me he had already guessed exactly why we were here. Beside him sat an older Velkar noble I did not recognize, whose bearing carried an unmistakable air of authority. I would later learn his name was General Vray Calthorn, head of the house responsible for everything that had happened to us. The session began with a formal presentation of evidence, and it was Leora who chose to speak first, standing at the center of the chamber floor, with a composure that silenced the murmuring crowd almost instantly. 3 months ago, she began, I was sent to Corathene Minor, a world officially designated barren and worthless, by 3 separate Dominion surveys conducted over the past 2 centuries. I was sent there, as many of you are aware, following years of quiet mockery regarding my lack of psionic ability, a mockery some of you participated in directly. A few uncomfortable shifts moved through the assembled nobles, though nobody spoke to interrupt her. What I discovered on that world, she continued, was not barren land, but a deliberate, decades-long effort to hide its true value from the wider dominion. A rare mineral compound, capable of significantly enhancing shielding and power efficiency technology, discovered decades ago and buried in sealed survey records rather than reported, in order to protect exclusive access for whichever house managed to quietly secure control over the planet's official worthless designation. She gestured, and one of the Oversight Council officials activated a large display at the center of the chamber, projecting the old survey files we had recovered from the abandoned outpost, the encrypted records, the mineral scans, the careful documentation of a discovery that had been deliberately erased from official Dominion knowledge. This is not the only thing that was hidden, Leora continued, her voice growing sharper. Decades before this planet was officially claimed by the Dominion, an independent human colony settled there, adapting successfully to conditions every subsequent survey would later claim were unlivable. That colony was forcibly relocated, its existence erased from official record, not because it failed, but because its success threatened plans already in motion regarding this planet's quiet exploitation. The chamber had gone completely silent now, every eye fixed on the display as it shifted to show images from the old colony structure, the faded human architecture, the careful records of survival techniques developed over a century earlier. And 3 months into my posting, Leora said, when it became clear that renewed human reclamation efforts on that same planet were beginning to draw outside attention, an armed force was sent to eliminate me quietly, before I could uncover, or report, any of what I have just described to this council. General Vray Calthorn rose from his seat then, his expression carefully composed despite the weight of what had just been presented. "These are serious accusations," he said, his voice steady, "built entirely on evidence conveniently gathered by an exiled princess and a foreign attaché with every motivation to fabricate a story that paints House Calthorn as villains. The mineral readings have been independently verified by a research vessel with no connection to either House Skorath or House Calthorn," Leora said. "The old survey records bear encryption markers consistent with equipment from the era in question, verifiable through standard Dominion archival methods. And the armed force sent to Korathine Minor left behind equipment traceable through supply requisition records, which this council is welcome to examine directly." I stepped forward then, feeling the weight of every eye in the chamber shift toward me, and spoke for the first time since we had entered. "I want to add something to what the princess has said," I began, keeping my voice steady despite the unfamiliar pressure of the moment. "When I first arrived on Korathine Minor, I was told, quite directly, that humans were considered fit only for postings nobody else wanted, that we lacked the value, the ability, the worth that other species brought to important assignments. I have heard variations of that same judgment throughout my entire time working within Dominion territory." I gestured toward the display, still showing images of the old colony's careful, patient adaptations to a planet everyone else had given up on. "What we found on that planet, both decades ago and in the past 2 weeks, tells a very different story," I continued. "A story about what happens when people who are underestimated are given room to prove otherwise, whether that is an entire colony of settlers, a princess dismissed for lacking abilities her family valued, or an attaché nobody expected to matter beyond a forgotten posting." I looked directly at General Calthorn as I finished. "You built an entire scheme on the assumption that nobody would look closely enough to notice what you were protecting. You were wrong about that. And I suspect you were wrong about a great many other things you assumed about the people you tried to erase along the way." The chamber remained silent for a long, tense moment after I finished speaking. Then Governor Munn rose from his position among the oversight officials, his expression grave. "The evidence presented today," he said, "meets the threshold for a formal independent investigation into House Calthorn's conduct regarding Korathine Minor, spanning both the recent armed action against Princess Vale Tirun and the historical suppression of survey findings and colony records. Until that investigation concludes, House Calthorne's activities within this sector will be subject to full oversight review, and General Vray Calthorne will be required to answer formally regarding both incidents. General Calthorne's composed expression finally cracked, just slightly, a flash of genuine anger passing across his features before he forced it back down. This council would risk destabilizing an entire noble house's standing based on evidence gathered by an exile and a human, he said, though the certainty in his voice had noticeably weakened. This council, Governor Munn replied evenly, exists specifically to investigate claims of exactly this nature, regardless of who brings them forward. If the evidence proves accurate, the standing of House Calthorne will be a consequence of your own actions, not the identity of those who uncovered them. The session that followed stretched on for several more hours. Additional questions from various council members, careful cross-examination of the evidence we had presented, formal requests for the independent research vessel's verified readings to be submitted for official record. Throughout it all, Leora remained steady, answering each question with the same calm, precise clarity she had shown since the moment we first fled the palace weeks earlier. By the time the session finally concluded, with the formal investigation into House Calthorne officially opened, something in the chamber's atmosphere had shifted in a way I do not think anyone present fully expected when the day began. The murmurs that followed us out of the chamber no longer carried the same dismissive tone I remembered from my earliest days within Dominion territory. They carried something closer to careful reassessment, the sound of an entire court quietly reconsidering assumptions they had held, comfortably and unchallenged, for a very long time. The formal investigation into House Calthorne uncovered further evidence supporting everything we had presented, additional buried records, testimony from former survey personnel who had been quietly pressured into silence decades earlier, financial records showing the quiet, indirect channels through which House Calthorne had profited from restricted access to Corathene Minor's true resources. General Vray Calthorne was formally stripped of his council standing, pending the investigation's full conclusion, and House Calthorne's broader influence within the Succession Council weakened considerably as other houses distanced themselves from the growing scandal. Corathene Minor itself, meanwhile, underwent a transformation few could have predicted just months earlier. The mineral discovery, once verified through proper official channels, drew serious interest from research and development divisions across multiple Dominion houses, all suddenly eager to invest in a planet they had dismissed as worthless for centuries. Leora, drawing on the authority she had earned through everything we uncovered, insisted on terms that protected the planet's development from the kind of quiet exploitation that had defined its history for so long, terms that included proper recognition and resettlement rights for descendants of the original human colonists, wherever they could be located across human territory. Callum's small reclamation experiments, once dismissed as an unglamorous side project beneath the attention of serious Dominion engineers, became the foundation for a much larger, properly funded terraforming initiative, drawing interest from human and alien researchers alike, all eager to understand techniques that had proven successful where more advanced alien methods had repeatedly failed. I found myself, in the months that followed, in a position I never could have imagined when I first accepted a posting everyone considered a joke. No longer simply an attaché assigned to a forgotten princess on a dead world, but a recognized figure within a story that had reshaped how at least one corner of the Dominion viewed humanity's place among the wider galactic community. Leora, for her part, was no longer called the Barren Princess by anyone who valued their standing within the court. The nickname, once a cruel joke told behind closed doors, and sometimes not even behind closed doors, had quietly disappeared from use entirely, replaced by a grudging respect that even her harshest former critics found difficult to withhold, given everything she had uncovered and everything she had survived to bring that truth back into the light. I remember standing with her one evening, months after that first tense council session, looking out over Corathene Minor's gray hills from the palace's rebuilt outer wall, watching small patches of green spread steadily across land that had once been declared permanently lifeless by every survey team that studied it. They mocked us both, I said, for very similar reasons in the end. They decided what we were worth before ever giving either of us a real chance to show them otherwise. They did, Leora agreed. And I suspect, across the wider galaxy, there are countless others facing the same quiet dismissal right now, judged unworthy before anyone bothers to look closely enough to see what they are actually capable of. What happens now? I asked. She turned to look at me, her violet eyes carrying none of the tired resignation I remembered from our very first meeting, replaced instead by a quiet, steady determination that had clearly been growing in her since the moment we first uncovered that buried mineral survey deep in an abandoned outpost. Now, she said, I intend to make certain this planet, and the people connected to it, are never dismissed so carelessly again, and I suspect, given everything you have shown yourself capable of these past months, you intend to do the same for your own peoples standing within this galaxy. I thought about that for a long moment, watching the small patches of green continue their slow, steady spread across the gray hills below us, proof that patience and quiet determination could accomplish what more powerful, more celebrated methods had repeatedly failed to achieve. I think that's exactly what I intend to do, I said. The galaxy had mocked both of us, in its own way, long before we ever met. It had called her barren for lacking gifts her family valued, and called humanity unworthy of anything beyond forgotten, unwanted postings nobody else wanted to accept. Neither judgment had ever been true. It had simply taken the right kind of pressure, the right kind of danger, and the right kind of quiet, stubborn refusal to accept a title we did not believe, to finally prove exactly how wrong that mockery had been all along. Corathene Minor was no longer barren. Neither of us had ever truly been what they called us. And as the sun set slowly over hills that were finally beginning to bloom, I understood that whatever came next for either of us, the galaxy would be watching far more carefully than it ever had before, and this time, for entirely different reasons.